Sure, slavery is a topic that many people find controversial nowadays. Even though we all think it was really bad, we might not have learned a lot about it in school. Slavery was more complicated than we might realize, and it wasn't just about black people. Surprisingly, even the white people were also enslaved. So, in African history, there were different types of slavery, kind of like how there are different flavors of ice cream. These types were influenced by things like the Roman way of slavery, Christians' thoughts on it, Islamic slavery through the Muslim slave trade, and later on, the Atlantic slave trade. Now, picture this. Slavery was like a puzzle piece in the economic structure of African societies for a long time. But how much it was a piece of that puzzle varied from place to place. Let me tell you a story from the 14th century. There was this traveler named Ibn Battuta, and he went to Mali, an ancient kingdom. When he got there, he noticed something interesting. People were like, "Hey, look at how many servants and slaves I have." It was almost like they were having a competition, like who had the coolest toys. And guess what? They even gave Ibn Battuta a slave boy as a hospitality gift. Imagine that. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, things got even more interesting. The relationships between slaves and their masters were like a complicated dance. Some slaves had rights and freedoms, like rules to follow, while others didn't. It was like having different levels in a video game. And here's the twist. In many communities, they had their own little hierarchies, like who's on top and who's not. They even made distinctions between those who were born into slavery, like being born into a special club, and those who were captured during wars. It was like having different roles in a big play. Many Europeans saw enslaved people merely as property to be bought and sold. This type of slavery was called chattel slavery, and it was super harsh and cruel. It treated people like they weren't even human. Here's the thing. Europeans had this idea that they were better than indigenous and African folks. They believed in something called white supremacy, which means they thought they were superior because of their skin color. This terrible belief was used to justify the violence of slavery for a really long time. Now, let's talk about how people became slaves. One common way was during wars. Sometimes it was on purpose, like a strategy to get more people to fight for you. Other times, it happened by accident when they were dealing with captured enemy soldiers or regular people. Some were snatched away from their homes in raids or pirate attacks. And guess what? Many slaves were born into slavery because their parents were slaves too. It's like a never-ending cycle. Sometimes, people ended up as slaves as punishment for doing something wrong, or because they owed money. Others were sold into slavery by their own family members, like their parents or even their spouses. It was sometimes done to pay off debts or to avoid starving. At the worst, some unwanted kids were left out to fend for themselves, but luckily someone else would rescue them and turn them into slaves. It's pretty heartbreaking. And then there were those who chose to sell themselves into slavery. Some did it to climb the social ladder and become part of the elite, while others did it just to escape poverty. Back in the 15th century, something awful started happening. European colonial powers began this big operation where they transported enslaved people from Africa to faraway lands. It was a terrible journey across the Atlantic Ocean, and the conditions were just horrifying. Once they arrived, the enslaved people had to work as slaves on plantations in the Caribbean and in the North and South America. There was this trading pattern called triangular trade that became a thing. European merchants would bring stuff from Europe to Africa, like clothes and tools. Over there, they'd swap their goods for enslaved people. Then, They'd sail to the Americas and sell those enslaved folks. But it didn't stop there. They'd load up their ships with goods made by slave labor and take them back to Europe to sell. Here's the heartbreaking part. More than 12 million African people were taken into slavery, and at least 2 million of them didn't survive the brutal journey across the Atlantic. The violence from the slave raids and kidnappings caused the deaths and suffering of millions more. Even though slavery had been against the law in places like France and England for a long time, they still went ahead and enslaved millions of black people in their colonies far away from home. It's like they had a double standard, saying one thing but doing something totally different. In the year 1619, a Portuguese ship named São João Bautista embarked on a journey across the vast Atlantic Ocean. What made this voyage deeply tragic was its cargo: African people from Angola, a region in southwestern Africa. Among these captives were men, women, and children, probably hailing from the kingdoms of Ndongo and Congo. Their journey was nothing short of a nightmare, filled with suffering as they were headed for a life of enslavement in Mexico. The horrors of this voyage took a heavy toll. Nearly half of the captives lost their lives before their journey met an unexpected turn. 2 English pirate ships intercepted the São João Bautista. They rescued the surviving Africans who had endured so much suffering. These rescued individuals were then taken to a place called Point Comfort, a port situated near Jamestown, which was the capital of the English colony of Virginia. This colony had been established by the Virginia Company of London just 12 years earlier. John Rolfe, one of the colonists, later wrote to Sir Edwin Sandys, a figure associated with the Virginia Company. He mentioned that in August 1619, a Dutch man-of-war arrived at the colony. Interestingly, this ship didn't bring much except for something truly significant: 20 and odd Negroes, as Rolfe described them. The governor and the merchant in charge of the colony purchased these Africans, likely in exchange for food or other supplies. The fate of these Africans was to be toiling in the tobacco fields that had recently been established in the Virginia region. Well, as we conclude our exploration of this important historical chapter, I'll leave you with a question to ponder. How does understanding the past influence our actions today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this video informative, remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more thought-provoking content.